Good evening, Your Royal Highness, Ministers, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the opening dinner of the 13th IISS Manama Dialogue Regional Security Summit. We are delighted that this dinner and the event it opens is held under the patronage of His Royal Highness, the Crown Prince of the Kingdom of Bahrain, Sheikh Salman bin Hamad bin Isa Al Khalifa, Deputy Supreme Commander and First Deputy Prime Minister. It is splendid that our host tonight is Deputy Prime Minister Sheikh Mohammed bin Mubarak Al Khalifa, for it was with him in this hall in 2004 that the IISS inaugurated the first Gulf Dialogue, as it was then styled. As Bahrain's Foreign Minister, when we were first planning this summit, he pledged that he would ensure the presence of ministers from the region, and I promised to bring in those from the key outside powers. We each kept our part of the bargain, and since then the IISS has been proud to host this summit annually, each year seeking to adapt the format and the participation to the special needs of the time. At present, one of the most alarming international trends is the rapid decay in the formal international institutions of regional cooperation. Across every part of the world, governments and public opinion are questioning the relevance and the effectiveness of institutions, often created by another generation in different strategic contexts and with mandates that have not evolved. We at the IISS are not content simply to observe and comment on disturbing trends or to satisfy ourselves with pious criticisms of formal intergovernment institutions. Part of the mandate we have given ourselves is to assist international defense diplomacy and foreign policy consultation by providing large and small platforms for policy innovation and to explore the opportunities for strategic cooperation. The Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore, our South Asia Conference in Oman, and this Manama Dialogue are all efforts by the IISS to take strategic action itself to inspire better informed and more effective international policy. As the pace of change in this region and between it and the wider world accelerates, it is all the more important that the IISS increases its presence and its activities in the Middle East. We aim to do more in the coming years to connect governments, international business, and expert strategists from the Middle East with their opposite numbers in North America, Europe, Asia, Africa, and Latin America. There is also a growing requirement for the fact-rich, dispassionate, empirically based analytical research that the IISS conducts. That is why over the next year we will be working to boost our capacities at our IISS Middle East office located here in the Kingdom of Bahrain and to generate first-class analysis and events at a high operational tempo. I am delighted that as from spring next year, the resident executive director of our IISS Middle East office will be General Thomas Beckett, at present the Special Envoy to the Middle East for the UK Secretary of State for Defence. He is well known to the national security establishments throughout the Middle East, and we expect the IISS Middle East office here will grow and further flourish under his direction, providing facts, generating analysis, and exerting influence in the service of better public policy. I hope that many of the defense and military experts gathered here will have an opportunity to sample our new digital database, the Military Balance Plus, that offers fast access to live defense, economics, and procurement information. It covers the current military strengths of some 173 states and many non-state armed groups. We believe this rich data set will change the very nature of defense analysis. The detail on the Middle East will be of special interest here, and by next year we will have strengthened our capacities to cover the region in even more detail. From our office here in Manama, we shall be generating work on all the themes of interest here: the wars and conflict that rage across the region, the policies and influence networks of Iran, the growing interest of the Indo-Pacific states in the Middle East, the new security need for innovative forms of military cooperation and changes needed to ensure that economic growth and prosperity are delivered to the youthful populations of this region. Every day of every week, there is fresh news from or about the Middle East. Governments, ministers, and officials are constantly pulled, almost literally, in different directions to agree statements, represent a view, strike a deal, agree a new formula, however long its diplomatic half-life. In pulling together this Manama dialogue, the IISS has been in touch at the highest levels with the US administration, European governments, Middle East and Asian foreign and defense ministers, as schedules have changed and new priorities suddenly visited upon governments which had reason to think that some policies would stay the same, even as everything else was in apparent flux. We have seen in recent days and months that settled diplomatic arrangements can be suddenly upended without much warning, and that strong national perspectives are not easily moderated through institutional mediation. So in these hyperactive times, it is perhaps worth pressing the pause button this evening to briefly review the current strategic scene in the region, the better perhaps to see the wood for the trees. And so tonight, I wanted to give an opportunity to Sir John Jenkins, our departing Executive Director at the IISS Middle East, to offer his thoughts on the regional scene before he leaves his formal role at the IISS. As most of you know, he served as UK ambassador to Saudi Arabia, Syria, Iraq, Libya, and Burma, and was also posted as Consul General in Jerusalem. With that background, spanning over 30 years, I think that he is well placed to put our discussions over the next day and a half in proper perspective. JJ, floor is yours.
Your Royal Highnesses, Ministers, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I want to thank John Chipman for inviting me to give this address this evening. Last year, we had, of course, Boris Johnson, the British Foreign Secretary. So I beg your forgiveness for having yet another British speaker talking to people from the Middle East and North Africa about the Middle East and North Africa. But my excuse is that this is my 35th year in this region. And it may be my last as a resident in this region for some time. For the past year, I've also been teaching at Yale in the US, as well as making regular visits back to the Gulf and elsewhere. And I feel it's time that I returned at last to my roots, to live for the first time in many years in the UK, not least so that when we finally leave the EU, I'm not left behind as the removal vans drive off. I also need time to reflect on the events of what have been a tumultuous 3.5 decades in a part of the world I love, which has suffered more than most from internal strife and external interventions. The first time I set foot in the Middle East was at the end of March 1982, when I flew into Syria from a war-torn Beirut to try to learn what Arabic actually sounded like when it was spoken on the streets by real people. This was only a few weeks after the destruction of Hama by the tanks and artillery of Rafat al-Assad's defense companies, and 6 months after the assassination of President Sadat by the extremists of Al-Ghahad al-Islami. The Israeli army was poised, as we now know, to invade Lebanon. The Iranian Revolution was 3 years old. 1979 also marked a watershed in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, as Prince Mohammed bin Salman has recently reminded us. There was war between Iran and Iraq. There were tens of thousands, as opposed to hundreds of thousands, of Israeli settlers in the West Bank, and no fence around Gaza. Different versions of the Ba'ath Party ruled in Damascus and Beirut. Damascus and Baghdad. The Afghan insurgency, out of which sprang Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, was in its infancy. The US was the overwhelmingly dominant global power in the region. And looking back from this distance, you can trace both ruptures and continuities. The Ba'ath no longer rules in Baghdad, and its rule in Damascus remains under severe pressure. Israeli settlement activity redoubled in the 1990s, not just in the West Bank, but also in East Jerusalem, in spite of an active and, at the time, hopeful peace process. Leaving aside the question of the Sheba farms and Rajar, Israel no longer occupies southern Lebanon. The Iranian Revolution is 38 years old this year, but all recent polling suggests most Iranians want to rejoin the world. The Taliban no longer rule Afghanistan, but they still pose a serious threat to the stability of any Kabul-based government. Russia has re-established itself as a major force, and in the future, the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative has the potential to transform not just trade and energy flows, but geopolitics. Around 60% of the population of the Middle East and North Africa in 1982 were under 24. Now it's 50%, but of a much bigger total population. In many countries, not least those of the Gulf, education, especially tertiary education, has shown remarkable progress, especially among women. At the same time, income disparities have grown, as they have everywhere. And unemployment is an increasing problem, as is labor force participation, again, especially among young people and women, 47% unemployment among the latter. Bahrain is one of the few countries that has a good record in both these areas. There are economic and social challenges of this sort, which are produced in large part by accelerating globalization. The remarkable rise of China and India, unforeseeable 35 years ago, is also part of this story, as are the populist discontents of the United Kingdom, the US, and parts of Europe. But when I look back over 35 years, I see two major continuities: the sustained recovery and rise of Iran, and the spread of radical and often violent forms of Islamist ideology. Iran is a major power in this region with a long, remarkable, and highly distinctive history and culture. But in 1982, it was not foreordained that it would expand its power and influence to the extent we see today, when for the first time since Xerxes, it is seeking to establish itself on the shores of the Mediterranean and in the process risking a new Middle Eastern war centered on southwestern Syria. In 1982, the destruction of Hama was the end of the savage uprising in Syria launched by the Fighting Vanguard, which had emerged from the activist end of the Syrian Muslim Brotherhood in 1978. It seemed, after that, and the tracking down of the assassins of President Sadat, that radical Islamism had been smashed. As it turned out, it was merely incubating future and even more savage insurgencies. Egypt, Syria, and the Afghan Jihad produced some of the most notable theorists and practitioners of what His Royal Highness the Crown Prince identified at this forum 3 years ago as one of the major challenges of our age. Abdullah Azem, the ideologue of jihad as an individual obligation. Abu Mus'ab al-Suri, the ideologue of a global jihad. Abu Bakr Neji, the ideologue of tawahush, savagery as a deliberate and foundational strategy. And of course, Osama bin Laden and Ayman al-Zawahiri. Today we see the Islamic State losing physical control of extensive areas in Syria and Iraq. Al-Qaeda is under pressure too in Yemen and elsewhere. But both continue to have footholds in Libya and the Sahel, in the border areas of Afghanistan and parts of Southeast Asia. And most important, the ideology that they promote, which is the latest in a long line of revolutionary Islamist ideologies from the foundation of the Muslim Brotherhood in March 1928 to the present, continues to appeal to a small but significant number of disaffected people across the world. And in some ways, by focusing on the violence that these groups practice, we lose sight of the real threat, the way in which Islamism as a textual, exclusive, and intolerant ideology seeks to take the place of the communal, inclusive, and tolerant experience that is the overwhelming daily practice of the lived faith of Islam. This is the real blasphemy. Both Iran and radical Islamists have fed on discontents in this region that emerged from the flawed creation of the modern Middle East in the 1920s, of which we were part, the loss of Palestine, and the failure in many parts of the region to address the challenges of social inclusion, effective, responsive, and distributive government, and social justice. They have also fed on serious mistakes by outside actors. The overthrow of Saddam's Iraq in 2003 with no adequate long-term plan to provide security and provide for the construction of a better state in the aftermath of his fall. The similar failure over Libya, compounded by intervention from others on the side of Islamist militias, and confusion, which continues to this day, over what sort of government we in the West prefer, in spite of Libyans voting overwhelmingly in 2012 for a technocratic and non-ideological government that would deliver a better life to ordinary Libyans. The error we made in Afghanistan in believing that the removal of the Soviet Union would solve all our problems, the failure to respond adequately to the first stirrings of popular revolt in Syria, and then to enforce our own red lines, and the sustained failure, for whatever reason, to see that the Islamic Republic of Iran was an equally ideological Islamist state, whatever its people actually wanted, and to push back against it in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen. The result has been that where we create vacuums, Iran and radical Islamists rush in. Certainly not like angels, and not like fools either, but like something worse. I think this matters profoundly, not just to this region, but to Europe, the US, India, Russia, and China. Yet we seem no nearer finding a basis for the collective action, sustained over decades, that it seems to me is the real answer to the challenges we face. And this collective action is the point of the Manama dialogue. It's the only regional forum that considers at the highest level all the issues I describe and seeks to identify common ground for action. This is why we value it. We've already witnessed one session this evening addressing the issues of stabilization, extremism, and terrorism. We shall talk in the next 2 days more about extremism, international partnerships, Yemen, Iraq, and economic reform. All these are part of the jigsaw I describe. But as Marx said, the point is not simply to interpret the world, but to change it. And here is where I'm optimistic. There is greater awareness today within the region and in global capitals of the interconnectedness of all the problems I have described and the need to work together to resolve them. Over the past 30 years, the two most strategic, skillful, and determined actors across the Middle East and North Africa have been Iran and Islamists. There are signs now that we might be prepared in some ways to match them. The massively ambitious plans of Prince Mohammed bin Salman for economic and social reform in Saudi Arabia aim at exactly the same targets the West has been urging the kingdom to hit for decades. The UAE, from which I've just come, has shown that it is prepared to invest over the long term in order to shape a better future, not just for its own citizens, its own young people, but those in other countries too. President Sisi in Egypt has shown that he too knows how urgent the task of economic reform is. Bahrain, in many ways, blazed a trail. And around the region, the energy, creativity, and aspirational level of young people never ceases to amaze me. Release and channel this energy, and the future is bright. What we in the West need to do is to match this energy, this clarity of aspiration, and this new determination to reform with an equally cohesive and collective response. And assuming, in the conditions of modern politics, that such a thing were possible, I would start with 5 things. First, bring a satisfactory end to the war in Yemen. I entirely understand why this started. Yemen is as strategic for Saudi Arabia and the Gulf as Mexico is for the United States, or North Africa and the Levant are for Europe. But it is causing distressing damage to ordinary people and distracting attention and resources away from what I see as a much more important task of rolling back Iranian influence in Iraq and Syria. And this, for me, is the second task for the US and Europe. In Iraq, we need to deal with the aftermath of the disastrous Kurdish referendum by helping the Kurds, the KRG, come together again as a stable political community and re-establish a stable relationship with Baghdad. In parallel, we need to help Prime Minister Abedi, who is riding a surge of popularity, create the sort of regular, fair, non-sectarian, forward-looking and properly representative political structure that I firmly believe most Iraqis want, but which they certainly do not have at the moment. And if there is a moment to do this, it's when you're ahead. This is so rarely done in most parts of the world. If there's a deal to be done, do it when you're winning. Third, we need to constrain more effectively Iran's ability to cause disruption as they do across the region, including here in Bahrain, when they have the chance. This includes also constraining the ability of Iran's subalterns, such as Hezbollah, to do the same, not just in the Levant, but globally. Fourth, we need effectively to support programs of reform in Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Bahrain, Egypt, Morocco, and elsewhere. And fifth, and this is a point close to my heart as the former British ambassador, we need to reach out and open, not close the doors of education to young people across the region from Morocco to Iran. They are the future. I should add another item to this list, namely reaching a just settlement of the Palestinian issue. This is, of course, topical. I spent in total 10 years of my life in London, Jerusalem, and elsewhere working on this issue, to add to the hundreds, probably thousands of years that we have collectively spent. I have Palestinian friends. I have Israeli friends. What I say to the latter is that now is the time. The question is not how much the Palestinians want a state, it's how much Israel wants a Palestinian state. And given the state of the region and the willingness of many states in the region to consider new approaches, Israel should want one badly as the key to its acceptance and to clarity about shared but too often hidden interests. If we can resolve this issue, which is not going away, as we see with the response to President Trump's recent announcement on Jerusalem, we can at last move on to the bigger threats. All this requires the sort of collective effort and vision we have not seen perhaps since the early 1990s. Given other stresses and strains, it's perhaps not an ideal moment. But as Field Marshal Foch is reported to have said during the First Battle of the Marne, "My center gives way, my right retreats, situation excellent, I shall advance." And I should end perhaps on a personal note. I have loved my 3 years at IISS in Bahrain. I have felt very welcome here. My team, many of them Bahraini, others Egyptian, Lebanese, French, Sri Lankan, and Indian, have been an inspiration to me. They are young, apart from myself and perhaps one or two others, and enormously talented. I'm sure my successor as executive director, Tom Beckett, who was born, I think, in Bahrain, but is not as old as I am, will find them as rewarding to work with as I have. And it's a tribute to His Majesty the King, to His Royal Highness the Crown Prince, and indeed to the government of Bahrain as a whole, that we all work so well and productively together here in the Pearl of the Gulf. If only Western leaders and politicians can work together as effectively with you and other progressive forces in this region over the next few years, we have a bright collective future, and I stress collective. The key is determination, resilience, strategic patience, and vision. Our opponents have all this. We need to match them. Thank you.